Welcome to Full Speed Ahead. I'm here with Ashnu Prasad here in New York City. You are the founder of Leaf, formerly known as the Logistics Exchange. We have a common sort of view of the world.
Yeah.
Financial markets entering in transportation. What is the story of Leaf?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Craig. We do have a common view of how we think this world is going to operate, right? This logistics space that we've both lived in for a while, and we kind of see 10, 15 years out, it's going to be different, fundamentally different. And so, yeah, with Leaf, we kind of had a similar thesis to say, if we could bring financial market tools to work in transportation, would it have made our lives better? You know, thinking back to when we were budget holders or some of us working on the asset side or the non-asset side of the provider space, would it be helpful to kind of rethink how forward-looking data could help us make the market more efficiently? And so, yeah, that sounds great. And, you know, there's lots of analogies that can be drawn to other markets that have gone through a similar evolution. At the same time, we also had a ton of appreciation for the people who do this work every day. Lots of very smart people working very hard. So the story of Leaf is, while we called ourselves Logistics Exchange, which is more than a mouthful, was very deliberately in beta to say, look, there are going to be a handful of people who kind of get this just off the bat, right? And we want to work with them to really shape how a forward market in transportation would work. And so that's what we've been doing for the last couple of years, heads down, working with some of the early adopter, fast mover type customer types. And then very recently, when we started to see some of the seeds germinate, we said, look, now the time is right for us to say, this is what Leaf Logistics is about. Let's reintroduce ourselves to the broader set of potential customers and stakeholders, because we think that there's a lot of use for this in the today world, not just for a future state when potentially we have a tradable market like we do in other areas of our economy, but in transportation right now for this year's RFP or this year's business that you need to secure.
Now, you're a forward market, which often, and I know this painfully well, and you probably do as well, is sort of the cousin of a futures market. They're both financial contracts, but a forward market has physical delivery.
Exactly.
In it. So a futures market is a marketplace that's cleared, which means you have financial. So they often get confused. And I remember the first time I read about Logistics Exchange, American Shipper, before we owned it, had written an article about the Logistics Exchange. You guys had done a press release or had done an interview, and in that article, it talked about a futures market, and I had 5 people send it to me like, what is this? And as I dug into it, I was like, no, that is a forward market. They're cousins, right? They're sort of related, but they're like distant cousins. I would love for you to describe what a forward market is and what do you guys do?
Yeah. So, and you and I have talked about this a little bit in terms of sort of.
I mean, people are like, and it still happens.
It totally does.
I'm sure for you,
it oddly happens with people in finance in New York, and you talk about what we're doing, and it's like, oh, that's kind of a future.
I had one of my own investors reach out and say, hey, this Leaf thing is like another. No, it's a forward market.
Yeah, I mean, so even more than the cousins, I would think that long term, there's, by design almost, a correlation between a forward market and a futures market. That just makes both markets better. And it makes the overall market more efficient, right? And every other mature market that we have in the world has that. You know, a good, correlation you can point to. So if you go to a customer and say, look, you want to truly physically and then financially hedge your exposure, think about how these two things interrelate. And then you and I have had that conversation about how, as we develop the respective offerings, how can there be a correlation that's identified using data?
Yeah, it seems like, there should be a lot of room for collaboration.
Yeah.
There shouldn't actually, they're not zero-sum outcomes. They're
absolutely not. Yeah.
It's sort of like a portfolio with a mutual fund, and you balance it between your forward business, which is physical, and your futures, which is about risk management and sort of managing that as
That's
well.
exactly right. So, I mean, I think the way that we describe it is literally about the physical provision of transportation capacity at a future date at a set rate, right? You and I can go onto an oil, futures market trading platform and trade oil futures and hopefully never see a barrel of oil on our lawn in the morning. Yeah. But there's somebody selling that oil and somebody buying that physical oil underneath. And that forward market is obviously directly related to the futures market. In fact, if the relationship isn't strong, then neither market really works efficiently.
I think in some ways we leapfrogged sort of the evolution of markets by building a futures market without a binding forward market. Our job is difficult in some ways because the basis risk of how correlated those are creates a challenge, a set of difficulties that's different. You have an opposite or a slightly different problem, which is you're changing physical behavior of how people are buying transportation. I'm wondering, how do you deal with you walk in and you're selling this really fascinating and important concept, but there's got to be a lot of friction in the market to adoption because you're changing the way they think about routing. How do you handle that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that change of behavior or working against the status quo that kind of works the way it works today is the biggest challenge to what we're doing in the first couple of years and probably for the next few years too. And that really just goes back to my point around, we have a ton of respect for how hard this job is. Finding loads in the market that actually work for the business you're trying to build as a provider, or finding capacity that actually fits like a puzzle piece in your portfolio is hard. It's been hard for 20, 30 years. So can you really solve a today pain point? And that's where, instead of even talking by analogy, we're really talking about the forward market less like an instrument and more like, imagine if you had a digital dedicated fleet today and you could get them on a schedule for the next 6 weeks because you're going to run freight on that lane because you've got a business need going into Q4. What would you do for that in terms of providing guaranteed capacity to ensure that nothing in your supply chain as a shipper gets disrupted, or vice versa? Everyone's got sort of, hey, is peak season going to happen? Is it not going to happen? And you just sort of like try to find your way through it, as we've all done for a long time. But what if you knew that 2 trucks a day were locked down for you for the next 6-week period? Would you operate your business differently? So kind of bringing the concept of a forward market back to the real world that people are, fighting hand in day.
It's the pop-up fleet scenario.
Kind of, yeah. Like,
I mean, it always struck me because we looked at forward markets at one point. I could never personally it was very difficult to sort of understand where the liquidity would come. But it struck me the most interesting would be the pop-up fleet scenario where companies were taking on capacity over a couple of weeks or months, as you described.
Right. Yeah, so the pop-up fleets, the surge capacity, those types of needs, in past lives, we've seen them over and over and over again. There aren't really good solves for it. But
there's no visibility.
There's no visibility.
You can get a rate index, but it doesn't tell you, like, these pop-up fleets are priced in a vacuum anyways, and they're committed months before.
Right, and it's been really hard to even just get to the contracting conversation. So what we really did was we built a basis for digital contracting, whether you wanted to do it for 4 weeks or 52 weeks, and said, what if there was a way for you to take each of those future loads and make it tradable? What if you could standardize away some of the aspects that make this a one-to-one contract like a pop-up fleet or even a dedicated fleet is, and say, I could abstract some of the complexity away and take it off your books if that, summer is going to have a weak shoulder period, right? Mm-hmm. And some of those uncertainties, I think, have gotten in the way of really utilizing pop-up fleets or surge capacity extensively. But frankly, once you start peeling that back, what we found was, when you looked at the entire portfolio for a shipper over the course of a year or even multiple years, 20, 40, 60% of their freight actually has patterns of predictability. It's just not a stable flat line, which we wish it was.
I mean, there's always seasonality. Even in this market, as soft as it is, there are surges. It's the inconsistency of those surges that create stress on carriers to sort of respond,
Absolutely.
And shippers for that matter. You've been in market for how long?
9-10 months now.
And are you seeing, is there liquidity building in the market? Are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, part of that was we were absolutely, fixated on making sure that the first few trades that people entered into were safe.
Yeah.
Like, it was a safe space, right? So it's kind of like in our past lives, if you entered into a dedicated fleet contract, and then year 3, markets got soft again, someone in the organization was coming back to you and saying, hey, wasn't that a bad idea?
Couldn't we, from the shipper's perspective?
From the shipper's perspective.
The carriers are fine.
The carriers are fine, but then when the market gets really super tight,
they want the upside.
Yeah, it's like, we could have chased all this opportunity. Why are we locked in these? And so that sort of opportunity cost thinking that people have had for a while, we knew that was at least going to be a psychological hurdle to getting people into these committed contracts. And so we were absolutely fixated on making sure that the first few contracts that people wrote, there was a lot of redundancy there. So if someone needed to trade out, it turns out people haven't needed to trade out all that much.
So they're going all the way to physical settlement.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Almost without exception.
As a founder of an exchange, you would want that in and out trading, would you not?
We would, but I mean,
you want the solution to work.
The solution should work, and there should be a lot of liquidity in case someone wants to 90% trade out. But for the time being, what we really need to build is trust. Right? One of the impediments in our industry has been, how do you actually establish a standard basis for trading in and out of something? Yeah. So we need to establish that trust with the individual customer to say, no, this thing works better than
You're the only truly contract, because I hate the word contract rates. Yeah. I just hate them.
Yeah.
Like because of the word, you can't sue somebody in court. But in your world, these are binding.
These are
forward contracts that you can litigate. There is an outcome. Now, have you had to deal with a company not honoring their contract so far?
Not honoring the contracts, because honestly, what we do have in our industry is the relationships matter, and you need that provision of capacity the next week. And
are you standing in for those contracts if they don't honor?
So we don't stand in for them, we enforce them. Okay. So we have mechanisms built into the contract that says, look, you're supposed to ship this load every single day for $1,000. Week 4 you didn't ship, you're out $1,000, and there's a payment stream here out of which we'll deduct that, which frankly we have mechanisms for.
Is the money coming through you guys? Or
yes, it's coming through us.
You're doing the clearing on that? Got it. Where does this end up for you guys? I mean, this is knowing how financial markets, and we've launched futures, and I remember we got our first trade the day of, and
everybody was excited
for weeks, and where's the next trade? And so they're slow. They're not overnight. It's much easier in some ways to build a digital brokerage per se, because you're on one side of the transaction. It's quite easy.
Yep.
To build it, but in your world, you've got to get two sides. That strikes me as a pretty. I know this personally, and it strikes me as a pretty tough.
It is tough, but I think
it's a massive opportunity if you can be successful.
Absolutely, but borrowing a page from the digital freight brokerage folks who really led the charge, right? They've changed customer behavior from what used to be true 5 years ago, and I think there's an appetite, and part of it is really, as we were talking about, finding those customers who kind of get the idea that they need to at least try different things. There is an appetite to try different things in your portfolio. So where this is going for us, and we're starting to have these conversations and laying some of the technology piping right now with some of the initial customers, is to automate a continuous decision-making process, not change their workflow per se and kind of have them go into a trading screen on Leaf to start buying forward contracts, because they don't do that today. But just to say, look, there's going to be, as my forecast comes into closer focus, and as I've got historical patterns where there's seasonality that's kind of known, and those two things converge, I want to be able to pull the trigger on a forward contract without having to get my people into it.
Are they going to get, is it a phone call? Do you guys have a trading floor?
We allow them to give us a call at this point, and that'll continue because people need to get comfortable with what this is and who does what, right? But fundamentally, it should be something that kind of, we think of it as step 0 in your routing guide.
Yeah.
Right, so your forward contract is going to sail. As if you had a private or dedicated asset, you're going to load that thing unless something is really, really broken. So round 0 in your routing guide becomes your forward contract. How can we get round 0 into your current workflow so that no one has to think too hard about it on a day-to-day basis? But then as a management team, you can step back and say, what is the right allocation? And that's really what we're working on, is more dynamic, what we call dynamic contracting. So real contracting, but for some part of it that's bound, as opposed to the other stuff that's kind of floating with the market.
How do you deal with the fungibility between providers? So if a shipper were to lock in a contract and the contract's traded, how do you ensure that carrier, if that carrier drops off, how do you? They're selling their position, they're rotating out of it, and
right.
What if they don't like the carrier? What if they say, hey, I don't want blue trucks or orange trucks or red trucks showing up?
Yep.
I don't want that company. How do you contend with that?
To your point around a mature market, you'd have mechanisms to sort of say orange and blue trucks are sort of factored into the matching decision making. When you understand all of, at least a vast majority of the options that are available, and do you care about orange versus blue, or do you care about 53 foot versus a 48 foot, right? Right now, some of those data are just not there, right? And so what we really rely upon is there's a trust established with folks that are delivering for you today, and so that gets a certain score. And then there's the unknowns that gets us a completely different score. So it's kind of like a much more crude way of sort of saying there are windows or universes in which you can be matched, and you sort of set the rules as the shipper or the carrier. Yeah. There's some carriers who will say, trade me out of a contract, but make sure I never take a load for that particular shipper, right? And everyone has those, anecdotally or through history.
Do you think yourself today less as of an exchange, more as an enforcement mechanism for compliance? Or is it, do you really feel like you guys are building up an exchange? Because it strikes me as the sort of near-term opportunity is in creating enforceable outcomes that sort of in many ways arbitrate for both the carrier to be on the same terms?
I think that's
especially when you're going
yeah.
to delivery, if the same buyer and seller aren't rotating out, it seems like that's the opportunity.
It is in the near term for sure. So the way we clumsily talk about what we're doing is that's the marketplace part of what we do, but really we're here to create a market network. Mm-hmm. So the advantage of doing that and having the fungibility and the rules by which are right now crude to trade in and out, get more refined over time, is that you unleash network-wide coordination, right? Like, so you allow for true fungibility, you allow for people to actually go and take not just 20 and 40% of their volume, but 48% down to 52 or, whatever, but do that much more dynamically because they understand the rules by which they can do that sort of exchange. And on the provider side, you meaningfully then start chipping away at persistent problems like empty miles, right? You could start to say, okay, what is the opportunity for me to take that percentage of empty miles out of that market, out of that trade lane right now? Mm-hmm. And what's my comfort level with kind of going into a new shipper who I've never served before, but allows me to chip away at that empty miles? Where do I draw that line? Right now, it's really kind of a managed marketplace type solution, mm-hmm. but over time, it becomes more of a digital network coordinated through an exchange.
So who in the space, the freight tech companies, do you admire as like that? They're having the model, they're killing it. Who in the space do you most look up to?
Well, look, I'll throw a plug in here for FreightWaves. I think just, thinking about this with data and painting a picture for what's going out 10, 15 years, we have a ton of admiration for companies that are painting a big, broad vision. And frankly, also companies that are working in the today world, right? So, companies like Transplay and what UPS and Coyote have done to kind of really think about traditional brokerage and taking it forward a decade or two very quickly with data. I think that's a ton of work that's required.
Yeah, it's interesting you picked 3 very established. Mm-hmm. The Transplay story is, actually, if you date to J.B. Hunt Logistics, it's 30 years old.
Yeah. You
didn't pick some of the newer, the Uber Freights and the Convoys. And I'm wondering, when you look at that, do you think the established players end up winning the race?
So
if it's brokerage?
I kind of glossed over sort of the new entrants, but I alluded to this a little bit earlier in terms of digital freight brokers have kind of shown that there's a change of behavior possible with long established customers. Yeah. And Uber Freight, Transfix, LoadSmart, Convoy, et cetera, are all really good examples of that. They are, within a couple of years, which for people who've been in this space for a long time is really remarkable to witness, have established positions in some of these shippers' portfolios that are very, very meaningful. If you go back to, a brokerage 20 years ago, trying to get to the position where some of these companies, digital freight brokers, are in a shipper's portfolio, percentage-wise, it would have taken a decade, if not longer.
It is different, though. The whole world in technology is different because whether it's just on-demand delivery, what Uber as a car service has done. The world's changing. It's actually It's the speed at which people are willing to adopt new services. Really empowered by venture capital, where you don't have to make a profit short term, changes the game for everybody.
Absolutely,
but it really puts a lot of pressure on the incumbents.
But that why now question that even the venture capital folks rightfully ask very early in the conversation
about
us,
me,
and all of us. Why now? I think it is because of that sort of broader change in our day-to-day lives. I expect that if I order something from Amazon right now on my phone, that tomorrow it's going to be at my door.
And actually, if it doesn't, you're going to be really upset. I remember as a kid, as a little boy, watching cartoons, and 6 to 8 weeks for delivery, and you would wait, is it time? My son, who is 8 years old, doesn't still understand the 48-hour delivery. He asks, he's so excited about when it's coming. He doesn't want it. He wants it now. I'm like, dude, you're spoiled. This is if it showed up a week, it would be great.
I don't know. I tell my 13-year-old it's actually it would have been good for them to think about, maybe you should have a 24, 48-hour cooling off period.
Exactly.
Maybe you can buy things a little too easily.
So when when he was 6 at the time, when my 8-year-old, when Toys R Us went out of business, I was like, and he never really had bought anything online. I'm like, he cried. He was very distraught that Toys R Us was going out of business. And I showed him Amazon, and he was old enough where he could sort of fumble around it. He didn't know how to spell really well, but he could sort of touch the iPad and stuff. And the problem is he literally would order it, and he would go to the door, and he couldn't rationalize that it had to go through But then when he realized that the UPS guy or the FedEx guy was the one delivering the goods, he all of a sudden like held them as a hero.
Right.
And having friends at UPS, I shared the story with an executive. He got this care package in for Christmas where it was like a UPS hat and
that's awesome.
so they've been very kind. So he's now a diehard UPSer.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was talking to someone more our age around how they think about logistics, and this is not someone from the industry. And what she was describing was they now have a relationship with the UPS and the FedEx person that delivers to their building here in the city, right? Because that's how they see stuff showing up. You know, a big part of their basket now shows up through one of these services.
Yeah, for sure.
And that just literally wasn't the case 5 years ago. So to your point, the big sort of exogenous changes in our world will be felt in transportation, and there are already being felt.
It strikes me as in the just restaurant delivery. One of the restaurant magazines, B2B magazines, was talking about the fact that a lot of these restaurants can't survive because they don't know the delivery model. They think about that. A local family-ran restaurant who used to think about cleanliness and ambiance and food quality has to now figure out the logistics model to survive.
Right.
And most companies aren't built to think about logistics. And it's interesting because the folks that interviewed in this article were chefs that were talking about how that had changed their whole business model. It's like logistics, like I worry about the food and the ambiance of my restaurant, and I don't want to be dismissed the experiences coming in. And so it's a different world.
It totally is.
It's an exciting world.
It is an exciting world, but in the restaurant world has also changed a ton, right? In terms of just structurally, there are different types of models and whatnot. What you see with technology now, with sort of these containerized kitchens spread around the geography.
These on-demand. I mean, DoorDash has added its own kitchen now to sort of own more of the
But that's
product.
super exciting too, from an innovation perspective.
Oh,
I think you and I having this conversation with some early adopters, but over the decade, there'll be a lot more folks having parts of the conversation we're trying to have now. Well, frankly, that's happened in restaurants.
Yeah.
That's happened in so many parts of our economy over the last decade. It is inevitable.
For sure. I have to ask you, because you and I have had similar paths of trying to do financial markets and freight. How hard has it been to get VCs to understand how financial markets work? Because I would say 99.9% of the venture capitalists that I came across could not get their head around trucking, first of all, and then exponentially harder around futures.
So honestly, it's been harder for me at least to have the conversation around trucking, B2B logistics, and how it actually works. How it actually works in the day of the life, a day in the life of somebody managing that budget at a really, really big shipper or at even a modest-sized carrier or 3PL. Venture capitalists in general, if they're not really deeply mired in this space, have a hard time believing that there are 5 million white-collar jobs in the U.S. in logistics.
Yeah.
Just like it's unfathomable.
They can't understand it, and they think it's a niche.
Yeah.
You're like, this is 12% of the global GDP.
Right.
It's bigger than healthcare.
Yeah.
It's bigger than banking and insurance. The stuff that you guys love.
Exactly.
It's bigger.
But they can at least by analogy look at the evolution of what's happened in the electricity market or in the grains market or in green coffee beans, and they can always get sort of that conceptual analogy. But connecting this here and now world in B2B logistics, once they wrap their head around, is that really true? Is that really how it operates? To how are we going to make that leap, and is it going to take 30 years or 18 years or 8 years or 8 months? That's been the sticking point.
Well, hopefully we have put a lot of material out about markets, and you can refer to it as well. I applaud you for. I know this is a really exciting opportunity. As you guys build liquidity, it's going to be immensely important for the market, and it's going to change the way the market is constructed. And I know it's a long path to get there, but. Congratulations.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. I mean, it's been a long path in kind of conceptualizing it, but some of this stuff is happening faster than we thought. So it's always really exciting to kind of go and chip away at the problem. And we have an awesome team and lots of other folks who I think are all invested in changing the status quo, you guys included. And so, pretty optimistic. I think it's going to be an exciting couple of years.
Everyone knows Chicago is the freight capital of the entire world. I don't know why you think Chattanooga is. It's not. Why are we even having a debate about this? Let's put this to bed. Chicago versus Chattanooga. Everyone knows it's Chicago. That's the birthplace of the logistics industry. You're going down, Craig.